So far in this course then, we've been creating view applications with something called the Options API. Now, I've not explicitly said this at any point, but that's the way we've been building applications. The Option API is just a way that we use Vue to create components. Using it looks something like this, where we have a data function, a methods property, computed property, and any lifecycle hooks as well. All of these are just added directly to the component object itself, which we export. So by making Vue applications this way, we are just using what's known as the Options API. And this has been the way that we make Vue applications for the past few years. And we still do make Vue applications this way today as well. But with the release of Vue 3, Vue now allows us another way to create Vue apps using what's known as the Composition API. Now, when we use the Composition API, we basically get access to a setup hook or a setup function inside our component object. Now, inside the setup is where we will put all of our component data, methods, computed properties, and lifecycle hooks. Now, the reason that the Composition API was introduced in Vue 3 is because it addresses some of the limitations and drawbacks of the Options API. Now, one of the main drawbacks of the Options API is that it's much harder to group feature logic together. For example, for a component getting data and then formatting the data, we would have three moving parts. We'd have the data itself, we'd have a computed property, and a lifecycle hook. Now, all of these pieces of logic are spread out in the component away from one another, even though they all work together on the same feature. And you might also have logic for another feature in the same component around this, which is all spread out into its different separate pieces as well. Now, as your projects get more complex, this can become hard to read and therefore also hard to update as well. Now, with the Composition API, you can organize your code in such a way that groups feature logic together inside one setup function. Now, another benefit of using the Composition API is that we can easily create reusable logic and code with what we'd call composition functions or composables. For example, imagine you had a couple of components which listed blog posts in your website. In both components, you might use the same logic with a combination of computed properties, data, and methods in order to retrieve the data and filter those lists. Now, you don't want to repeat all of that logic in each component because it's exactly the same and that's just repeating your code. So using the Composition API, you can extract all of that feature logic into what we currently call composition functions or composables. Then we just inject those reusable functions into the setup function so we don't have any code duplication. Now, if you've ever used React hooks, this is a very similar concept. So they are the main two benefits of using the Composition API instead of the Options API. But remember, this is completely optional. You don't have to use it. You can still make Vue apps using just the Options API as we have been doing so far. And for small, simple projects, I still do that. However, for larger projects, which require a bit more organization, more code reuse, and more complex logic, I think using the Composition API is better suited. Not all of the time, but a lot of the time. And definitely as we start to work with authentication and databases in future projects, the Composition API will help us out a lot. And by the way, you can actually use a combination of both if you want to. So you can use the Composition API for some logic and still use the Options API for other simple logic as well. Now, going forward, we'll be using the Composition API about 80% of the time, but we might still dip into the Options API to set up certain things in our components as well. So in this chapter, we'll be learning all about the Composition API, and once we've learnt the basics, over the next few chapters, we'll be building a mini blog style application like this. So we can list all of our blogs, we can see the details of the blog, and we can see we've got different tags here as well, which we can click on the right to filter the blogs, so we only show blogs with those tags. We can also create new posts as well using this form. So this is what we're going to be building over the next 2 or 3 chapters. But first of all, I just want to talk about the basics of the Composition API.